Right. Hi, welcome everyone. I think we're just giving a bit more time for people to join, but it's 2 minutes past, so I think we will start the session. So welcome everyone to our last Women Working in International Development event for 2020. We hope the virtual event and the timing has enabled a diverse set of people to join from different continents, hopefully. Um, I would like to highlight a couple of things before we start. First is that we will be recording this event and we'll share the link to the video on our LinkedIn page. And secondly, please do type in your questions that you have and specify which panelist you would like to respond to that question within the Q&A. We will have 20 minutes for Q&A at the end of it. And any simple responses or technical queries will be responded by our colleagues on the call. So I'm going to quickly start. So my name is Sohasini Sudtharalingam, and I lead the economic development practice within the International Projects Group at BDO UK, and I will be moderating our session today. So welcome everyone. I would like to set the context of our discussion today, and then I'll get the panelists to introduce themselves before posing a few questions for them to respond in the first 40 minutes for them to respond, and then we'll have 20 minutes for Q&A from the audience. So please do send in your questions as we go along. So context for the discussion. Less than 2% of all funding go directly to local NGOs, despite the fact that they take the majority of the risks. In 2016, a mutual agreement between donors were undertaken under the Grand Bargain. They pledged to be more flexible and give more directly to local organizations. 4 years on, and international organizations continue to work in spite of local structures rather than with them. 2020 has seen more challenges to the structure of the international development sector, and more recently, we have seen cuts in aid budget. We've known for a long time that certain practices have dominated the international development scene, including some of the following, which is not an exhaustive list. Firstly, some donors are unwilling to fund national groups directly, and the excuse is that red tapes make it difficult to partner with local actors, or there is not enough funding for meaningful capacity building. Second, leadership positions are rarely held by local hires and are instead disproportionately staffed from the aid-giving countries. Third, the general reliance on international staff for positions which could be performed just as well, if not better, by local hires. And fourth, we are told that local capacity doesn't exist, or that we are victims of an overly professionalized sector requiring perfectly written English language reports to headquarters and donors. This mindset and more precarious contracts for local staff devalues their contribution and labor and means that their voices are not heard. Now, the focus of this event is grounding development in national contexts. We will explore the challenges that national consultants, particularly women, face when delivering international development programs. We have 3 amazing panelists who will address these questions and share their own experiences whilst considering solutions to overcome barriers that they face in countries that they operate in. So I would like to get the panelists to introduce themselves and explore what localization means for them and how is it perceived. Can we go to Tamara first, and then to Olivia, and then to Filloreta?
Yes, thank you, Soha, and hello everyone. Thank you for joining our event today. My name is Tamara Tamimi. I am from Jerusalem, Palestine. I work within the context that Soha presented. I work as a political economy analyst on a project called Takamol, which is an FCDO-funded project that seeks to support the Palestinian Authority in the areas of public financial management reform, public revenue reform, public administration reform, and revenue reform through the provision of technical assistance to direct counterparts within the Palestinian National Authority. My work as a political economy analyst is intended to support our technical teams and consultants in assessing whether the interventions that they want to implement and the reforms that they are proposing are politically feasible, whether at the macro level or at the micro level. With respect to the other part of the question, localization means to me that the project design and implementation takes into consideration the local context. And this pertains to the political, economic, cultural, and social dimensions, and any other dimensions that are relevant to the program being implemented here. Thank you.
Hi, I think I'm next. My name is Olivia Byanyima. I'm an entrepreneur and finance professional with about over 15 years experience in various analytical advisory roles across financial services, including investment banking, corporate strategy. I'm currently a senior transaction advisor on Manufacturing Africa, which is also an FCDO funded project in Uganda. I've worked as an independent advisor in a diverse range of clients, including DFIs such as the World Bank and early stage technology startups and everything in between. I serve on the investment committee of UNCDF, where I evaluate and vote on the fund's decisions to invest in early stage businesses. As an entrepreneur, I co-founded and run a luxury goods social enterprise called Olivia Knox. I also continue to advise startups through an incubator network here in Uganda, as well as through Columbia University's design initiative. I'm very pleased to be here. In terms of how I think localization is perceived, I think it's perceived as moving funds or funding and contracting and leadership to the local level. A good example is USAID's goal to channel 30% of its foreign aid directly through local institutions. And of course, for donors, localization helps them, eliminate costs, build capacity of institutions, and so on and so forth. But to me, localization is a bit more than just moving of funds. It means having more local people, and it comes down to people, local people and warm bodies, right? Local people involved in every aspect of the project, from planning to implementation. And that could mean the involvement of local consultants, which I believe, adds a ton of value at all stages of the project. So that's what it means to me.
Filloreta, your mic is not on.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah. My name is Filloreta Bytyçi, and I'm from Kosovo. I live in the capital city of Kosovo, Pristina. I'm very pleased to be a part of this event and to have a chance to share with all of you my experience working as national experts with different donor projects in my country. I'm policy development specialist, and during the past years, I have been mainly involved in working at central level of the government with implementation of the reforms in policy coordination and development. So I will be talking from this perspective when I talk also about how I see the definition of localization and how it is perceived and accepted within this area. I have, in general, it is perceived and accepted as strengthening local human and institutional capacities. Personally, to me, localization means development of implementable programs based on the priority needs and context of a specific country. It also means reinforcing local capacities, not replacing them. And it means that involving nationals at all levels in a very first decision-making process throughout the development and implementation of the project.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much to all our panelists. We've got a few questions that I would like to pose to the panelists and kind of start the discussion. So start off with Tamara. It is understood that there is an international domination of development projects and the setup of the development ecosystem. Many call this being structural architecture of the sector. Tamara, what are your thoughts on this, and how do you see that in practice in Palestine?
Thank you, Soha. Yes, I completely see what you are talking about. Even though my work on Takamol is the first on one of these development projects on a full-time basis, I've previously worked on with international donors on a consultancy basis for a short-term task. But this project is the first time I work on a full-time on a regular employment basis on one of these projects. I can see very clearly that there are certain parts of the projects that are dominated by a certain kind of people, and mainly internationals, and I'll get to that in a little bit. And other parts of the project where you see the local employees. So for example, the operations, the finance, and these kinds of sectors are locally dominated, but the consultants teams and the senior management are predominantly Westerners. And when I say Westerners, they say that there is a specific kind of Westerners that you see dominate this scene. And I mean, what I'm going to say, I mean it in the broader sense, not in the particular sense of the characteristics. So you see these international consultant sectors dominated by white, middle-aged or older men who are from a Western, quote unquote, developed country. And this creates a certain attitude in how they engage with the locals and with the counterparts, also possibly with the counterparts, in that they engage with their, from my experience, with their colleagues as if they are their charity case. So for example, as a young Palestinian woman, I felt different and was subjected to different forms of discrimination on the combined grounds of my gender, age, and national origin. It's not just because I'm a woman, it's because I'm a younger woman from an underdeveloped country, quote unquote. And these men consider me as their work here in Palestine as my charity case. As their charity case. They don't consider me as an equal. And thus, this has posed challenges on me as a political economy analyst who's intended to assess the feasibility of the design and the implementation of the interventions and reforms to get this through to my colleagues on why this current design it's unlikely to be very successful, or its effectiveness is likely to be limited because it doesn't take into consideration certain aspects. And like I said, because of the inferiority perception of my colleagues, I wouldn't say all of them, of course, there are individual exceptions, but because of the inferiority perception, this has been one of the major challenges that I have been facing over the past year. And it was only when, over time, that I've demonstrated my credentials that my colleagues started to take me seriously. And to be completely honest, not all of them. 1 year past my work on this project, I wouldn't say that all of my colleagues, they still take me seriously, and I need to find other ways in order to get through to them and to be able to fulfill, to carry out my job as it is intended to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. That's definitely very insightful. Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to go over to Olivia now, because I think some of the things you mentioned, Tamara, in terms of kind of taking into account nationals' view in terms of design and implementation, how does that work in practice? So Olivia, so this is the question for you. I mean, what is your view in terms of the significance of national context at early stages of designing and planning of programs?
So to me, it goes without saying that, you know, in order to plan anything successful, one must have good context. And international development should be no exception, even though many times it is. I strongly believe that involving locals in the planning stage of a project is the most straightforward and effective way to inject that local context into the planning process. I also believe that neglecting local context, such as cultural norms, without it can lead to perverse outcomes. And without local voices, you might miss certain nuances and not only fail to reach your project goals, but have perverse outcomes, as I mentioned. I've found myself in the really interesting position of being an international consultant who happens to be a local. And from this, I've found some really important learnings about the value of localization, even though I was kind of accidentally, I just happened to be a local, but I was hired as an international consultant. There are two main things that I found. One is trust, and the other is innovation. I'll start with trust. I think it's almost known by many people that there is low levels of trust among local stakeholders for donors in general. The levels of trust aren't very high there. And we could blame, historical context of colonialism and racism and things like that. But the levels of trust are really low. And I found that in the situations where I found myself in where I'll give an example. I'm a World Bank employee interfacing with a local stakeholder in Uganda. And that local stakeholder is basically knows me as a World Bank consultant. They have been in situations where they've called me before a meeting with the World Bank and said, can you come here and meet an hour early and take off your World Bank hat and let's really just tell you what we're thinking, right? And you advise us on how we can really engage with the World Bank when they come in an hour later. So I found myself in many situations like that, where the level of trust for the donor is low. And when they identify a local person on the other side, they kind of just take off their face and they say, listen, this is really what we're thinking, but is it acceptable to the World Bank? Can we feel safe saying that? They will feel safe telling me just because I'm a local. So trust, to me, if you have local people on your team and you're planning this project, you will get the most information, the most useful information, because you have locals on your team. The second one is innovation. And that's also from personal experience. I've found that local understanding of having a local while you plan a project will inform you where you should leave room for innovation and where you should be kind of more rigid, right? So if me being from Uganda, I know there's certain things that we shouldn't leave open because of corruption issues that are rampant in our society. But then there's also places where I'll say, you know what, here you should leave this very flexible because we might need to pivot in the future. And an example for me was a project I helped design and implement for the World Bank. During planning, because I had a seat at the table, I was able to say, listen, don't make this too stringent. Don't make this too, don't firm this up yet. Let's leave a little room to add more partners. Instead of saying, we're going to go with 3, because I see that these 3 may look strong right now, but what if they fail? And they did. So in implementation phase, we found that leaving that room because I understood that, yes, I sat across the table from them, I spoke to them, and I just felt like they might not, deliver. And had we just said, it's just these 3 and that's it, we may have not found the room to move after when we reach implementation. But because we had left that room, because I was at the table and I had that gut feeling and they trusted it enough to leave some room, we were able to pivot, add more partners. This is just one example. There were many other places where we were able to innovate and pivot. And the project was successful to the point that we actually beat the expectations, the project goals. And now we're kind of, the example of doing well on a project in that space. So to me, those two things, trust and innovation, are very big things for having, very big reasons to have locals in the on the planning stage. And of course, the perverse outcomes, we don't want to just focus on the negatives, but we've seen many projects where there have been perverse outcomes, like a project on Ankole cows in Uganda. These cows were acclimatized to a region. They were local to the region, but then they didn't produce a lot of milk. Donors came and said to this tribe of people and said, listen, you should have more. You should crossbreed your cows and should go away from your traditional cows and keep these Dutch Holsteins that produce a lot of milk. That's giving you another revenue stream. So they were completely focused on revenue streams, and the people did that. But what happened is that it killed all the traditional cows died out, and it's now causing a really serious biodiversity risk. It could cause shocks to the beef industry if these new cows were not acclimatized to the region. We have to pump them with drugs, keep them alive. They die at the drop of a hat. So they could just, one small disease could wipe them out, and there would be shocks to the industry. But nobody was there to think about, that local context, and also the impact on the people and who depended on it for their cultural norms and who were very tied to it culturally. So that's why I think it's important to have locals in the design phase.
Great. Thank you very much, Olivia. So what I've kind of picked out from what you said is, obviously it's very important to have a seat at the table, building trust, encouraging innovation, and obviously including local context. So if I move on to Filloreta then, in terms of, we've started off in the Middle East, we've moved to Sub-Saharan Africa, now we're back in Europe, and Filloreta and your experience in Kosovo, what are the perceptions of national experts in Kosovo? And in your view, how do donors engage with civil society organizations, national organizations, and national experts?
Yeah, thank you, Soha. Well, I'm all for involving national expertise at every phase, in every stage of a specific program development, during all the time. And why? Because national experts know people, culture, politics. They have language and communication advantages. They have knowledge of national legal and regulatory framework. They have knowledge on priority needs within specific areas and in general of the country. And the transfer of knowledge is easier if you involve local expertise. And this all together helps bridging between programs and beneficiaries, which is very important, because this then helps implementation of the program. And this then helps sustainability of programs and processes and etc. Now, what is the perception of national experts? I start from negative ones. And if I may say it, it depends really. It varies from one donor agency to another, one company to another, even from one individual to another. It has changed during the time here. As a new state, for example, in my country, we needed international expertise in order to help us with establishment of our institutions and certain processes, and to get and implement the best practices, best international practices. And during that time, we had mainly international experts involved in the projects, and there were here and there some local people. During the time, it has changed a lot. Now there are a lot of national experts involved in implementation of donor programs. How, for example, international colleagues, how some of the donor agencies perceive local national experts, well, it differs. Some of them still would actually engage national experts only at junior levels, not at senior levels. And they base that on thinking that national experts are not of high professional level, maybe. It's one of the reasons. Some I've been talking recently to some of my friends and colleagues. It's so strange because some of the donors, few of them actually, and don't take this for granted, but for example, do not prefer actually engaging national experts, real professionals with a huge experience. They rather go for, again, for junior level of expertise, and they do it in purpose for specific reasons. How they are, I don't know, how we are perceived from our people sometimes as well. It has changed during the time again. I mean, if you are aware that you need specific support, specific expertise in an area where you don't have local expertise, that's justifiable. But people have realized nowadays that it's in a way much easier to work with national experts for the reasons that I mentioned above. And I mean, it has changed. At the end of the day, it's up to everybody, each of us, how professional we are. Being national or international, it doesn't matter at the end of the day. If you are a professional and you do your job as you should be doing to improve something, that's it. That's the crucial point. I have to say that nowadays, for example, when I worked before the independence of my country with the DFID-funded project, it was only me and my colleague who were local people, and all of others were international experts. During the time, it has changed, because when we moved in the second phase of the project, there was a need for local people to implement specific processes. It has changed a lot. I'm repeating, in the current project that I'm working, we have only one international expert who is a team leader, and all the rest are national experts. And I see a lot, for example, with USAID projects, there are several cases where the actually chief of party is national experts. So when I'm talking now about I mentioned few donors that I've worked with mainly, I have to say that also at the beginning, at least this is the experience with my country, when we started building our institutions, there was a preference mainly to engage international companies, international civil society organizations, quite rare like local organizations. That has changed as well. And that has changed for good, because let's say civil society organizations are not used now only to reach, let's say, different communities in the region, but are using to implement really big programs of the donors. And in the meantime, there are several NGOs developed who have specific profile within specific area, and they do really implement now big project, let's say related to gender issues, human rights issues, mainly. And donors starting using them a lot as a partners or as a co-partners within implementation of specific programs. Same applies to also business companies, like companies that have grown up, have developed during the time in my country. Not a lot of them, but there are really some good ones. And they have developed a pool of national experts. And it's much easier for donors then to cooperate with them, because they have tools in their hands. They identify the right people, the right expertise, and to get them involved in specific programs. So this is in general my observation and my experience working as national consultant and working with different donor projects in my country. I might jump in later on with some few examples if there is the time for that.
Great. No, thank you very much, Filloreta. It's really refreshing to hear that things are changing. You know, donors are engaging more with local consultants. I'm looking at the questions as well. I think I might just start picking up some of the questions that we can respond to. And the first ones come from, first question is, basically wanting the panelists to comment on the overlap between localization and the decolonization agenda. So as you know, 2020, we've had a lot of discussion, at the back of, the murder of George Floyd, a lot of discussion around anti-oppression and decolonization. There's been a lot of discussion there. So can I maybe just get Tamara to come in terms of responding to this question of overlap between localization and decolonization agendas? Thank you.
Thank you, Soha. I think that this is a great question and a very important one, especially, and it's very relevant here in the Palestinian context. Having been under occupation for more than 50 years, and since the establishment of the Palestinian National Authority in 1994, the international donors have went to support the Palestinian National Authority in terms of building state institutions through a transitional period that was intended to go on for 5 years, but then has been extending indefinitely since then because of continued settlement expansion on Israel's part. What I mean to say is that in the Palestinian context, I see that there's a very direct link between decolonization and localization. Decolonization in the lack of applying political pressure on Israel to end the occupation, which is the main prerequisite and the most important component in establishing a Palestinian state and in reinforcing all of this funding that's coming to build state institutions. So the absence of this political pressure to end the Israeli occupation, it's going hand in hand, I perceive it, with the lack of localization of these development projects, in that it is funds, it's taxpayer funds that is being allocated to a specific context without ensuring minimal effectiveness through taking into consideration the local context and the local factors and designing the project in a way to ensure that it is owned by the local actors and thereby increases its chances of effectiveness. The second thing, of course, in the Palestinian context, all of this, even if the project is localized, all of these development projects, they need to come hand in hand with political pressure and a political will to apply pressure on Israel, so as not to sabotage or act as a constraint, as an occupying power to ensure or to increase the effectiveness of these projects. I will leave it at that, but if there's any follow-up discussion or questions, I'll be very glad to engage on this matter.
Great, thank you, Tamara. Olivia and Filloreta, would you like to come in with some comments on that question as well?
Well, maybe linked to localization again, which I think also links to what Tamara was talking about, because we have also here in Kosovo not the same, but similar experience and a lot of difficulties in establishing our, not actually establishing our institution, but even broader. I would like to emphasize one, to me, very important matter, which is the donor flexibility related to changes and implementation of the programs that they run in the country. During the implementation phase, due to unplanned rise in needs, for example, which was usually the case here in Kosovo. I don't know, perhaps maybe in Palestine as well. For example, I will give you an example of my country. At that time, I was working in the office of the Prime Minister with a DFID-funded project to support the development of the office and certain processes. And then it was around 2005, 2006, and it was before the declaration of our independence. Prior to settlement of the status of our country, we have been required by international community and imposed actually by international community to fulfill specific standards. So it was called like standards before the status. And being the country who just got out of the war, you know, and not enough capacities, even financial needs, etc., we were somehow stuck. So what the Office of the Prime Minister did, they requested help from DFID in order to help with implementation of the standards in reality, in country. And what DFID did, which was very useful and very significant for us, it was they simply added additional component to our project to help implementation of the standards before the statutes. So what we did is we supported our institutions to fulfill all the standards required by international communities. So I really believe that in specific countries, in specific cases, you really need to have this kind of flexibility in order to adapt the project. It doesn't go usually outside of the scope of the project. You can always find a direct link to it if you are willing to support, if you really are willing to support the country and the country needs.
I'd like to add a little bit to that, back to the question around decolonization and the relationship with localization. I think localization is a subset of the larger conversation around decolonization and around the fight for racial equality. And as you rightly mentioned, 2020 was a moment of reckoning and reflection in that fight. And we've seen a lot of businesses, large businesses, corporate America and other large businesses basically come out and issue strong statements around their understanding and what their role will be in this fight. Unfortunately, I haven't seen very much of that reckoning within the international development world or sphere. And I'm afraid that it's going to take a little longer for the industry to come to its point of reckoning. And it leaves me wondering when this will happen. But I think localization is completely topical and very relevant and timely. It's a timely conversation to have. It's exactly because of this global fight for racial equality. In an African context, I had talked about trust being a big missing gap. And one of the reasons I believe that many international development projects don't work is because of that lack of trust. And that lack of trust is rooted in colonialism and racism and those historical contexts. And if we don't have an honest discussion, if we don't have these uncomfortable conversations that the rest of the world has been having, if we don't have them within international development, we're going to stay exactly where we are, which is a low level of success rate in international development projects. I'm not sure, who's at the forefront of leading that conversation, but I'm happy to be a part of it now in our small way, and I hope that it goes further and more people are having this conversation.
Thank you to all the panelists. Yeah, completely agree. I think conversations are happening. It's about, I think there's different groups taking different leads. Obviously, donors have a lot of power in terms of taking things forward. In terms of influencing as well, donors in country, there is one question that has come up from a participant. If you have engaged with donors in country in terms of more funding for capacity building and governance, but also I'm going to change the question slightly in terms of influencing donors to do things differently within your country. Have you got experience in doing that, and how do you go about doing that? So open to the panelists who would like to respond to that.
Can I jump in? Yes, I think I have personally been doing this with my colleagues and the people that we work with. And this is what I actually wanted to mention as well, which relates again also to localization. I think that nationals should be more proactive. And I mean, it's not something difficult. There are moments where you need international help, but there are moments where you have to jump in and say, have your say on how, what kind of help you need and how. And I think that is very important. And that is also, that can be achievable. I think it's quite easy because I think also, at least from my perspective and my experience here, donors are very happy to hear from beneficiaries what they want. And when they get the right answers, I don't think that that supports lack. Of course, every donor has its own strategy and has its own agenda, in a way, put it this way. And you have to be, from the national perspective, very wise to find yourself within their agenda and somehow try to mix both agendas. And when I talk about agendas, I primarily think about the priorities of the country. You must find a way to achieve it. I said it's not that difficult, but it's not that easy as well. But if you know what exactly you need as an institution, I mean, I think that can be achieved. But there is a need for more proactivity. And I mean, there are institutions there are people in my country who are very active, but there are still, I mean, I think it's the situation elsewhere as well, where people simply are not that interested to do, to achieve something actually very concrete. So this is my thinking.
I agree, Filloreta. I think that speaking up is a big part of moving that agenda. Speaking up when you're the one sole voice as the only national consultant or local consultant. But then again, you are, if you're completely outnumbered, sometimes your voice might be drowned out. So I think that on top of that, we have to recommend more people to come to the table. We have to push for more local people at the table while we're sitting at the table. I think that's on us. I like to, and many times, sometimes, the donor community might just not have information on who the local people are. Sometimes it's honest kind of lack of information on who they should involve. So that's where we come in and recommend good people that we know on the ground that could join and also have a seat at the table. So the more voices, the more, the better localization works. So.
In the Palestinian context, I'm sure we can draw parallels within other contexts. I don't think the relationship between civil society organizations and the donor community, whether directly with the donor community, as Soha, you pointed out in the beginning that there is very little direct funding that goes from donors to civil society organizations, whether it is at this level or through international organizations and UN bodies. Basically, I don't think there is an equal relationship, and I think this manifests in the absence of mutual accountability between the two sides. I think there is an imbalance where civil society organizations are accountable to the donors themselves or the intermediaries. Whether it's the UN or international organizations such as Oxfam or Gvina or Diakonia or any of these international organizations, but that it doesn't go the other way around, and that this this accountability is it pertains to the equitable distribution of funds to development partners for organizations. Like you see many organizations receiving funding from all donors, while other organizations whose work is equally important, there isn't an equitable distribution of the funds for them. The other aspect is what is the kind of funding and what are the funding streams that civil society organizations receive, with many of the priorities which set by the international donors based on their agendas and their priorities, and whether these, irrespective of whether these priorities and agendas, they meet the local needs and they meet the national priorities. I'm particularly referring here to funding that comes to the Women, Peace and Security agenda in Palestine, and the wider funding that comes to human rights organizations, with Western donors essentially dictating what's being funded and what these organizations are focusing on. and what are the strategies that are employed in terms of international advocacy strategies, but also in, for example, considering, dictating the consideration of the Palestinian National Authority, which I do not relieve of its responsibilities, but dictating that it is considered not just a primary duty bearer, but also the primary duty bearer, without due consideration to the role, the very important role of the occupation in human rights abuses here in Palestine.
Thank you. Really, really insightful. We've got questions coming in. So what I'll do is probably direct them to one of the speakers to get through a few questions as we go. So the next one has come in from I'll read out the question and then I'll share it. One of the issues with localization is that the risks are transferred by donors to the implementing partners. And if these are international organizations, they then transfer the risk to local organizations, which are not ready to take them. And this would lead to failure in some instances. How can we support local organizations to be more ready and prepared for risks? Now, I'm going to add to this question, how can international organizations also be allies to bring in national organizations and support in terms of giving the space to deliver in country? So can I direct this question maybe to Tamara, if you're happy to respond to that?
Yes, thank you, Soha. I think that international organizations, and including the UN offices in a specific country, they can play a very big role by engaging more constructively with civil society organization and with the community, and identifying priority needs and identifying local capacities at the level of civil society organizations, and engage in policy dialogue with the donors. These international organizations and the UN, they can play this mediation role in a strong manner and facilitate bringing local points of views with international points of views more closer together. For example, let me give you a concrete example here in Palestine. We saw this more recently with the second generation plan for the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which is primarily financed by Scandinavian countries and particularly Norway. In line with Norway's international plan, which prioritizes the pillar of participation, Norway wanted to focus the national plan in Palestine on participation, while the Palestinian Women's National Movement, they also wanted to focus on the occupation. So they said, yes, participation is very important, but accountability for the occupation is also very important to us. It was the applied pressure by all Palestinian civil society organizations, but also international organizations acting as intermediaries that brought Norway closer to the national point of view. And the work of the Norwegian representative office, the national staff there, that convinced Norway, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Oslo, to decide to focus on funding both pillars. So reaching a compromise on the matter so that both priorities can be covered in a certain way here. Other forms that could be considered or other structures, there could be secretariats or other kinds of platforms that brings these different actors together, or that convene in different compositions, whereby international organizations and the UN and possibly the diplomatic representative offices here, they play a more active role in bringing international perceptions and priorities closer to national needs, I would say. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tamara. The next question, I think would be really good for Olivia, basically. So there's a question directly for you. So you made an interesting comment about being a local international consultant in Uganda. It'd be really interesting to hear more about that dynamic.
Yeah, it's a very interesting place to be in, because I find that, you know, it's a strange place to be. As I'd mentioned, we have, on one hand, we have, say, I'll basically explain my situation. I was living in the United States when I was hired by the World Bank. That was my first international development project. And the job was to design a project in the energy space in Uganda. I then had to come to Uganda as an international development consultant to interface with government and other institutions here in Uganda and business to figure out how to design this project. And I had to interface, of course, with the World Bank in the design process. And then I was also hired to continue on into implementation phase. I've found that, well, I was lucky that, first of all, the project leaders of this project allowed me the opportunity to advise, and they took my advice. I know I'm aware that many times this doesn't happen, especially because I was just a consultant. I'm not the project lead, but in this instance, they listened a lot to my kind of local knowledge and input. But as I mentioned, the trust issue is always there. And I found myself in situations where, say, the World Bank is a lender, obviously, and we're trying to lend to the government of Uganda. And we typically design a project and then explain it to the ministry in Uganda, and then they have to accept it, or they give, you know, feedback, and we have to basically agree on the terms. During that negotiation process, I found I was getting many calls from the government side, the local government side, and people were calling me from at all levels, right? From commissioner level to permanent secretary of the ministry level, calling me at random times sometimes and saying, listen, you know, your side is saying this, but we really can't accept this position. Maybe you should tell them, you know, this is a deal breaker, right? And they would find it more comfortable sending me to tell my team off the record and saying they will not accept this, and then we'll come back to the table with the understanding of where they are. So it smoothened the process, and it removed some of the formal barriers that sometimes exist. And I think it's about trust. I think if it were, you know, two, you know, Nordic countries negotiating, I think that it would be a smoother process. But here we're looking at a team, as Tamara mentioned, it's mostly, you know, white middle-aged men on one side of the table, and the other side of the table is all Ugandans. Just that is already a lack of trust. So I found myself always playing the bridge, and I liked that because I saw that it was adding value. But again, this lends itself to the localization aspect. I think that it's absolutely important to have local voices. But I found that was the most interesting kind of thing in that dynamic of being a local international consultant.
Thank you, Olivia. I think that's an interesting point that you reflect. You know, you have a group of white middle-aged men versus, you know, local Uganda leaders, and kind of opposite the table. I think in the UK, for example, on the corporate side of things, we're seeing a lot where the client are asking to see more diversity within what we can then provide. So there is definitely a shift that we're kind of seeing. But as you said, in terms of the international context, I'm sure there's more that can be done. We've got a few minutes. So my last question is really for Filloreta. And I'm going to combine two questions. So Filloreta, you made the point that involving nationals depend on the perception of other nationals as well as perception of the donors. So then the question is, do you have any experience of effective ways of addressing these issues? Also, it would be good to kind of get your thoughts on what are the kind of residual barriers of increasing localization So basically, the barriers to increase localization, in your view, as well as potential solutions and experience to sort of address that issue.
Well, the barriers should be sorted out if you have trust. And Olivia mentioned that as a crucial point. So there should be a trust among donors and national experts and national people in general. So I think the barriers can be moved also if you work jointly with nationals in order to, I mentioned earlier, to address priorities of the country. And how that can be done, and I have experience, for example, with SIDA, more lately, that they really pay attention to this issue, and they really involve the national expertise from the very first phase of identification of the program and then building up the program and etc. Even taking into the respect their own strategies and the goals within the national strategies of their country. So that is very, very important. I mean, very close cooperation with national and involving them in every stage of the program development. That is crucial to me. Then also another issue is donor coordination as well. There's a lot of overlap between donors with programs in the country and elsewhere. So they should also start thinking seriously, coordinating among themselves a bit better, but then again with nationals involved. So this is my my thinking. I mean, we should all aim in building jointly the projects, the programs from the very start and full stop. And that, I think, to me, is how localization can increase.
Great, thank you, Filloreta. We've had 59 minutes of the session. I think it's time to come to a close, but before that, I would like to run through a couple of poll questions, which I am launching now. If attendees could respond to this, 2 questions in terms of whether the session has highlighted any gaps in your understanding in terms of how you approach localization. And then secondly, could you identify areas within your sphere of influence where you could potentially do things differently? So be good to get your thoughts. Whilst I let the poll run, I would like to close the event. I would like to sort of say that we will share the recording and summary of the event on our LinkedIn page. There'll also be a question when the Zoom ends to ask if you like to be added to our mailing list. So please include your email address, so we'll keep you informed of the next event. And we welcome ideas and thoughts for the next event. So please do get in touch with us via our LinkedIn page, or reach out directly to myself and other colleagues within BDO. So how are we doing with the polling question? Great. So we're bang on 1 o'clock now. I would really like to thank all our speakers, panelists today, for sharing their personal insights. They've put in a lot of effort thinking through the questions and bringing some of the experience to life. So thank you. And also for the audience for your questions and participation. We look forward to having you again at the next event next year, and wish you a restful and joyous festive season, and hope to see you in the next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.